Mom is going to live with us, too. Facing me, who had just purchased the top floor of a 50-story luxury apartment building. My husband said this with a grin, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. If you don't like it, get out. Together with Chris, my mother-in-law laughed derisively at me. This pair had always been like this. They had always treated me terribly. And they acted as if it were perfectly normal, showing no signs of remorse. I looked down to block their gazes, to hide my sneering mouth and the ugly distortion of my smile from them. My husband, who had neglected me and our children and had never cared for our home. And my mother-in-law, who had egged him on. I was determined not to be manipulated by them anymore. With that resolve, I forced a vague smile onto my face and looked them in the eyes. That is, I cannot. That's what I muttered in my heart as I looked down again. Facing me, who said nothing back, my husband and mother-in-law hurled abuse. Let them keep underestimating me. In the background, I had been warming up a plan for a long time. To confront my deluded husband with the truth. And on the day of the move, a flood of calls came from my mother-in-law. Oh, caught on? By now, Chris and my mother-in-law must be panicking. And upon discovering the harsh reality, they will scream. My name is Gina Ford, a 47-year-old working housewife. I currently live with my son Tom and my daughter Sarah. My husband, Chris, has been on a business assignment for years. And we haven't even been in contact for many years. Our relationship can hardly be called familial, it's that distorted. However, it wasn't always like this between Chris and me. We met at a company drinking party when I was 23, and he married. Chris, 3 years my senior, was a lively and engaging person. At my first drinking party, I was nervously stiff in a corner when he cheerfully approached and brought me into the group. This sparked my admiration for him. He took care of me, and we soon started dating. Chris was always bright and fun, and I was increasingly drawn to him. However, Chris was a bit of a smooth talker and often nodded along without really listening to me. This slightly clueless aspect of him was overflowing with humanity. And at that time, it was attractive to me. As my feelings for him grew, I seriously wanted to marry Chris. He must have noticed my feelings because one day he earnestly proposed to me. Overwhelmed with emotion, I nodded through tears and dreamed of a happy married life with him. However, when I went to greet him for the marriage, there was a slight hitch. His father was a sensible man, but his mother seemed unable to let go of her son. Gina, you are still only 23, right? Can she really support Chris properly at such a young age? You can't even manage household or work properly, can you? I doubt you can handle child rearing either. Being bluntly criticized like this made me shrink back. Then, his father, with a calm voice, reprimanded his wife. What are you saying? You were the same age as Gina when you married me. And you gave birth to Chris when you were 25, didn't you? His father's words silenced my mother-in-law, albeit grudgingly. Seizing the moment, Chris cheerfully said to them both. It's okay, Mom. Gina might be young, but she's serious and hardworking. So she'll surely make a good wife. Right, Gina? You'll get along with Mom, won't you? I nodded honestly to Chris's words. Well, if Chris says so. With a sigh, my mother-in-law seemed somewhat resigned. With Chris's words and his father's mediation, I felt reassured and decided to marry him. At that time, I was truly young. When I reported the marriage to my own family, my parents were very happy. But my older sister frowned. My sister, 2 years older, was a good confidant who always listened to my stories. And she must have felt something off about my in-laws' situation. Are you sure this is okay? Shouldn't you date him a bit longer? I shook my head at my cautious sister's words. It's okay. After all, Chris trusts me. I was eager to marry the person I loved and took my sister's concerns lightly. In retrospect, I regret not taking my sister's words more seriously. Knowing my determination, my sister sighed lightly and looked me straight in the eye. All right. If you say so, I'll support you with all my might. Then she took my hand and continued. But if anything happens, make sure you consult me. I'm always on your side. Thus, surrounded by blessings, Chris and I got married. However, even after our marriage, my mother-in-law's snide remarks and nagging didn't stop. And despite being newlyweds, Chris took me to his parents' house every weekend. I'm an only child, and I want you to get along with Mom quickly. Unaware of my uneasy expression, Chris forcefully took me to his parents' house. Initially, in front of his father, his mother freely criticized me. But as his father continued to reprimand her, her attitude softened. Relieved for a moment, my mother-in-law then began to make snide remarks in secret. When her father and Chris were not listening, she blamed me. Unable to consult anyone, only the years passed by. However, the situation slightly improved later. 2 years later, my son Tom was born, and 2 years after that, my daughter Sarah was born. Using the busy days as a reason, I pleaded with Chris to reduce the frequency of visits to his parents' house. Even without this, Chris rarely helped with household chores or childcare. Even if my in-laws are close, given the current situation, it's impossible to visit every week. But Mom insists on seeing Tom. You should show some filial piety occasionally too. I almost blurted out, then why don't you provide some family time? But I swallowed my words in desperation. Despite my daily hustle with childcare and housework, all that came out of Chris's mouth was about his mother. He kept saying she was lonely or concerned about Tom. I couldn't help but wonder, which family does he really care about? After getting married, I realized that Chris was excessively attentive to his mother. Probably because she doted on him excessively. And such doting by his mother was another headache for me. Yes, another reason I didn't want to go to my in-laws was not just my mother-in-law's snide remarks. While she doted unconditionally on her grandson Tom, she showed no interest in her granddaughter Sarah, treating her dismissively. However, she didn't express this by being sarcastic as she was with me. Instead, she maintained complete indifference. She would buy toys and sweets for Tom, but nothing for Sarah. She only spoke to Tom. And she always repeated the same thing to Tom. Tom, you are the heir of the Ford family. So you must listen well to what Grandma says. Each time, the young Tom would tilt his head and look up at me with a puzzled face. Mother, I'm sorry, but that's a bit. As I hesitated to speak, my father-in-law next to me quickly picked up Tom and peered into his son's face, saying, Tom, you don't have to listen to Grandma. Instead, you should grow up to be a kind man. As my father-in-law spoke gently, Tom giggled happily. Thus, each time my mother-in-law tried to indoctrinate Tom, my father-in-law gently steered him away from her. Since Sarah was born, my father-in-law started speaking differently to Tom. Tom, do you like Sarah? Yes, I love Sarah. Then, promise Grandpa that you'll protect your sister. Yes, I can promise. Perhaps my father-in-law sensed something. He made a pinky promise with Tom. This happened when Tom was 6 and Sarah was 4 years old. The difference in my mother-in-law's attitude towards Tom and Sarah was blatantly obvious to anyone, even to the young children. That's why my son and daughter, who had become aware of things, were attached to the kind and gentle father-in-law. But not to the grandmother who showed interest only in her grandson. Tom always looked sad and asked me, "Why doesn't Grandma treat Sarah the same way she treats me?" Seeing my son hug his sister tightly made my heart clench. That's when I started visiting my in-laws even less frequently. I was already disliked by my mother-in-law, so I didn't want to get close to her place. Moreover, my mother-in-law's excessive behavior towards my children. All of these reasons led me to refuse to visit my in-laws, using childcare and household chores as excuses. My primary concern was to protect my children's hearts. At first, Chris grumbled about us not accompanying him. But perhaps dealing with my steadfast refusal became too troublesome for him. Eventually, Chris started visiting his parents alone on weekends. Thus, naturally, a distance grew between us. And a year later, when our daughter turned 5, my father-in-law passed away due to illness. And Chris's life became even more centered around his mother-in-law. With the loss of my father-in-law as a buffer, Chris stopped asking me to visit my in-laws. Perhaps my mother-in-law said something to him. Chris started visiting his in-laws after work and prioritized his mother over his family even on holidays. He had always put our family second, and this worsened. Eventually, Chris spent most of the week at his parents' house. While I struggled with the gap growing between us, I was also overwhelmed with daily childcare and household chores, and I let the issue slide. And a year after my father-in-law's death, Chris's returns home became as infrequent as a few times a month. As a result, he almost had no interaction or conversation with the children. Desperate, I pleaded with Chris to fulfill his responsibilities as a father. "Hey, the kids have a sports day coming up. You alone are enough for that." Chris dismissed it outright. Besides, on that day, Mom has asked me to do something for her. Again, it was his mother's errand. I inadvertently confronted Chris with a stern tone. "But the children's events are once in a lifetime. You're their father after all." "No, Mom is getting old, so it's only natural to prioritize her. What about our family, our daughter, and our son's feelings? How many times must the children have asked when their father would return or come to see us?" Each time, I soothed the children. Then, with tears welling up in their eyes and lips pursed, they looked so brave. How many times that sight pained my heart. Chris always said, "You and the kids lack consideration for Grandma," angrily blaming us and storming out to stay with his mother for weeks. This continued for years, and I finally began considering divorce. But with only my part-time job income, I was unsure about supporting 2 children. That's when I remembered what my sister had said. My sister, who had not looked favorably upon our marriage. Her concerns had become a reality. I decided to call and consult her. After hearing my story, my sister chuckled slightly. Just as I thought, it turned out the way I feared. Actually, at that time, my sister was also married and in a similar situation. Hearing my story, she felt very uneasy. "I should have talked to you more thoroughly and stopped you." Sighing with self-deprecation, my sister shared an idea with me. Additionally, she offered financial and childcare support. It turned out she had divorced a few years ago and was providing me with various useful insights based on her experience. Currently, she was living alone near our parents' home and working. Following her advice, I began to gradually prepare for a divorce. At the same time, my husband, who had hardly been coming home, told me over the phone that he had suddenly been transferred. "I don't know when I'll be able to return, and Mom is going with me," he said briefly and hung up. I was surprised, but this situation was actually a blessing in disguise for me. While he was away, I acted steadily towards my goals with the help of my sister. The idea my sister had shared was challenging, but it made each day fulfilling. Seeing this, my children stopped mentioning their father. Instead, they started to support me. Their encouragement gave me strength. 3 years later, I finally achieved my goal. By that time, the financial support from my husband had ceased. But I had successfully become a full-time employee in a certain industry and was supporting the family financially. Little by little, the preparations for divorce were coming together. During this time, the children grew up healthily. The years flew by with their entrance and graduation from elementary and middle school, and then high school and college entrance exams. Of course, I had contacted my husband multiple times, but he never returned from work to attend any of the children's school events. 14 years had passed since his transfer. By then, my son was working, and my daughter had reached adulthood. Suddenly, Chris returned home with his mother. It was such an unexpected return that my children and I were shocked and looked at each other. Ignoring our confusion, Chris acted as if he still ruled the house, just like when we had lived together. Our irritation grew with his arrogant attitude. Both my children and I were indifferent to Chris, who had never shown any familial duty, responsibility, or, most importantly, affection. Hey, what's with that attitude towards the head of the family, you guys? Who do you think allowed you to live comfortably? My son responded with a sardonic expression. Who? It was all thanks to Mom. What? There's no way a mere part-time housewife could support a family financially. Stop talking nonsense. Watching him rant, I suddenly questioned. Hey, why did you come back now? Chris answered arrogantly. Mom recently hurt her leg and became bedridden. She needs care. Nodding, my mother-in-law also agreed. Chris then told us about a more dreadful plan. We'll all live here together, and you and Sarah will take care of Mom. Facing his words as if it were a natural family obligation, we looked at each other. You've never acted like a father before, and now you're playing the family card? Exactly, we have our own lives. Besides, we're moving out to a new place. What? What are you talking about? You just need to listen to me. Faced with his selfish words, my children and I decided to mercilessly execute the plan we had prepared. Actually, you know the luxury apartment near the station? What? The 50-story one? Thinking he was caught, I continued without confirming or correcting. We decided to move there. I tried contacting you, but you never responded. What? Then, Mom and I will live with you in that house. As he said something absurd, his mother nodded vigorously next to him. You must be joking. Absolutely not. My children and I desperately refused to live together. But Chris and his mother wouldn't listen and were fully intent on moving into the tower mansion. Mom is going to live with us, too. Facing me, who had just purchased the top floor of a 50-story luxury apartment building, Chris said this with a grin, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. If you don't like it, get out. Together with Chris, my mother-in-law laughed derisively at me. This pair had always been like this. They had always treated me terribly. And they acted as if it were perfectly normal, showing no signs of remorse. I looked down to block their gazes, to hide my sneering mouth and the ugly distortion of my smile from them. My husband, who had neglected me and our children and had never cared for our home. And my mother-in-law, who had egged him on. I was determined not to be manipulated by them anymore. With that resolve, I forced a vague smile onto my face and looked them in the eyes. That is, I cannot. That's what I muttered in my heart as I looked down again. Facing me, who said nothing back, my husband and mother-in-law hurled abuse. Let them keep underestimating me. In the background, I had been warming up a plan for a long time. To confront my deluded husband with the truth. And upon discovering the harsh reality, they will scream. On the day Chris and his mother moved in, I had actually moved to a different single-family home with my children. Yes, moving to the luxury apartment was just a ruse. By now, Chris and my mother-in-law must be panicking. As evidence, my smartphone was flooded with calls from them. I answered the call from my mother-in-law in a deliberately relaxed tone. What's the meaning of this?
Yeah.
Why aren't you guys here? Oh, caught on? Then I confront my husband and mother-in-law with the harsh reality. The kids and I have already moved safely. Hearing this, my husband and mother-in-law scream. What do you mean? Explain this. They complain to me upon learning this. However, I rebuff them, pointing out that they were the ones who arbitrarily decided to live together. Moreover, I use the long period of separation as grounds to push for a divorce from my husband. I had decided on a divorce and consulted my sister, who introduced me to a lawyer specialized in divorce, and I had been consulting with him. I was fully prepared. My husband resisted. But when I informed him that the divorce could be granted based on our long separation, he finally agreed to the divorce. At the end, he spitefully said that he didn't care if a part-time housewife who bought a house without savings struggled. In my heart, I muttered that it was okay, because I was already working as a full-time employee. And then I hung up the phone. Yes, my husband, who had neglected our family for 14 years, didn't know that I had gone to nursing school and become a nurse. When I discussed divorce with my sister, she suggested that I could attend nursing school using a nursing scholarship, which doesn't require repayment if I work at the sponsoring hospital afterward. In fact, my sister had also become a nurse using the scholarship and was working. At that time, she told me that our hospital was hiring and suggested I apply for an interview. Gratefully, I took her advice, and that has brought me to where I am today. Also, my husband didn't know that our son had landed a job at a top-tier company. Our ability to move into a single-family home was thanks to my stable job and my son's high income, which significantly eased our financial situation. And the luxury apartment I bought for my husband and mother-in-law to live in wasn't a new building. It was a 60-year-old building past its warranty period, rumored to collapse immediately if there was an earthquake. That's why I was able to buy it for a song. My husband must be shocked by now, thinking he was going to live in a new luxury apartment near the station. But that was just a misunderstanding he had from listening to me. 3 months after divorcing my husband, he and my mother-in-law were brought into the hospital where I work. Afterward, they gave up living in the apartment due to suspicions of it being a defective building, and seemed to be living in a rundown apartment. My mother-in-law, who was frail and had poor health, worsened her condition by catching a cold due to living in a drafty apartment without proper preparation. My husband also caught the cold from her and was running a high fever. I was dumbfounded by their lack of planning but continued my work indifferently. Eventually, a woman who appeared to be my ex-husband's new girlfriend visited them. Apparently, he had started dating her after our divorce. The girlfriend, who had come to visit, seemed to have been fed lies by my husband, as she verbally attacked me while I was taking his temperature. I've heard from Chris. You treated your mother-in-law terribly, didn't you? And you lied all along. While I continued my work, I firmly told her the truth. I don't know what you heard from my ex-husband, but this man prioritized his mother over everything else for 14 years, and never contributed to our living expenses during that time. What? The woman was visibly shocked. My husband protested, claiming it couldn't be true. I pulled out a bankbook I always carried from a file and thrust it at my husband. He checked its contents and uttered in dismay. It's true, but why? Stunned, my husband seemed to realize something and went to his mother's private room. He then asked her loudly, "Mom, I always left the money management to you, right? What's this all about?" While surprised by her son's fierce demeanor, my mother-in-law turned red and trembled. I had once heard about my mother-in-law's lavish spending from my father-in-law when he was alive. That's why my father-in-law had always managed the money in their household. Likely, my mother-in-law had embezzled the money meant for us. Misunderstanding that she could spend freely, she must have squandered it. As I explained this calmly to the woman, she looked horrified and broke up with my ex-husband on the spot. Then left the hospital room with loud footsteps. Watching her leave, my enraged husband cursed at his mother. "Everything is ruined because of you. What are you going to do about this? It's not my fault. What's wrong with using my child's money?" My mother-in-law threw a tantrum and cried out. Amid the chaos, I quietly stepped away from them. Later, during his hospital stay, my ex-husband persistently pleaded with me to start over. "There's no chance I will start over with you. Besides, I'm about to be transferred soon." Yes, I had been assigned to transfer to a hospital in the countryside. This place had too many bad memories. My children and I felt this way, so after discussing it among ourselves, we bought a house in the neighboring state to start a new life. 5 years later, my children received a call from their father that their grandmother had passed away. They hesitated to attend the funeral, but I encouraged them to say their last goodbyes. Later, they told me that their father had aged significantly when they saw him after a long time. And the funeral seemed shabby and older than his actual age. My daughter remarked quietly, "Hey, you guys, please. Aren't we family? Help me out." Although begged by their father, my son and daughter fulfilled their familial duties and returned home. And relatives, knowing the circumstances of our divorce, had distanced themselves from my ex-husband. In the end, he was left all alone after losing his mother. I think about it. Parents inevitably go before their children. Isn't it a parent's duty to guide their children to be able to walk on their own? I vow to myself not to forget this, and to maintain a healthy distance with my children's families to avoid the same mistakes as my former mother-in-law and ex-husband. Since then, I have been thriving as a nurse, maintaining a good relationship with my married children,